Salve everyone. We're picking up where we left off in Livy's Ab Urbe Condita, the founding of the city of Rome, or the history from that point. And we're talking about Porsenna besieging the city and this one noble youth of Rome, Gaius Mucius Scaevola, who has successfully entered the enemy camp, the Etruscan camp of the king Lars Porsenna, and he's just killed the scribe, the secretary of the king, thinking it was the king. He was attempting a regicide, but failing that, he has just killed the wrong person. And he's only beginning to kind of figure this out. So, vadentem inde, qua per trepidam turbam cruento mucrone, sibi ipse fecerat viam. So let's start from here. Vadentem, well, where is this coming from? Well, it looks a lot like a participle from vado, vadere, and this means to rush. So rushing from that point. And then here we get an interesting qua. Well, what is this qua? And that is a long A. We don't have any short, nothing would have a short A that looks like this. This is always, if you see qua like this, it's going to be ablative, singular, and feminine. So what are we talking about? It can't be Gaius Mucius because he's masculine. Well, whenever you see something that's ablative, singular, and feminine and kind of standing out on its own in Latin, there's a good chance that the thing that we're missing is the word via, way. So this is, of course, like a way, a path, and this can sometimes be very direct, very concrete. We're talking about a path through forest or a road or something like the Via Appia, but sometimes it's a bit more metaphorical, the route, the way, the direction, where it doesn't need to be something physical. So that's what qua is doing here. So we have rushing from that place by that way which. That's really what qua, by that way which. So why is it ablative? Well, it's saying by way of, and we see this now in English. We have a newscast and coming in via satellite, by the way of the satellite. Satellite's going to be an ironic word as we see just later right here, but satellite here means attendant. That's the actual root of the word. When we talk about satellites in space orbiting the Earth, that's because these royal attendants would orbit their king. But that's kind of gotten us ahead of the game. Let's focus on qua, which means by that way which. So we really have a via qua being kind of gapped. We're losing that via. Here, almost accidentally, but conveniently, we get that word expressed, and this will make more sense when we get there. But even if this weren't viam, we would be able to interpret qua as qua via, by which way. So rushing from that place by the way which, per the trepidam turbam, so through the fearful crowd. So we knew that this was a dense crowd in our last reading, a confortissima, a very dense crowd. Now it's also a scared crowd. Well, why is it scared? Well, we've got this going on, cruento mucrone. So what's a mucro? Well, that's the point of a sword. And then we kind of have a bit of what we might call, in kind of poetic terms, metonymy, which is kind of switching of names. That's a Y, not a G. Metonymy. So we're talking about the sword point, but when we're talking about the sword point, we're really talking about the sword. Compare this earlier to our word for sword, ferrum, literally iron. So we have a lot of kind of poetic words for sword in Latin. And it's not just Latin that will always do this, but it's also Livy. That's part of his very poetic prose style. And then cruento means bloody. So with bloody sword. So these are both ablatives. We don't know exactly how to interpret this yet. Can it be an ablative absolute? Well, the answer is no, because here's our noun. Cruento is simply an adjective. It's not a participle. So we can't say with the sword bloodying or anything like this. This is just an ablative word, mucrone, and then we happen to have an adjective working with it, the bloody sword point. Sibi. So this is, of course, the dative third person reflexive pronoun. Reflexive because it refers back to the subject, and the subject needs to be third person. It would be different if it was first person, I, myself, or something. Then we might have mihi, but because we're talking third person, it's sibi. So sibi, this is dative. So we had an ablative here, we have a dative here. This is probably going to be kind of an indirect object, but we don't know yet. Ipse. All right, well, that's nice. What is that? Ipse, ipsa, ipsum. That's the full dictionary entry. And this means either he himself, or she herself, or the thing itself. So here we have he himself, and because it's this form, the first entry of the dictionary, and of course this is just the nominative listings of a full paradigm of this pronoun, but we can know unambiguously it's nominative singular. If we look in our Latin textbooks, if we look in our grammars, we look up this form and it can only be masculine singular. So this is going to be our subject. So he himself fecerat. Well, that works out well. That's a long E because this is coming from facio, facere, feci, and then factum. Those are the four principal parts of this verb, meaning to make. So we're clearly coming from the third principal part. That means we're in the perfect system. And then we have to look at the ending. Well, this T ending tells us that we're third person singular. And this erat ending, this whole thing taken together, tells us that we're in the pluperfect. This is what's making this perfect, but we're even retrojecting this kind of further in the past. So not just made, but had made. So he himself had made weam, the way, a way. And then we say, this is the way which he took. So he's rushing and he's making a way for himself. So this is not exactly a dative of indirect object. We call this a dative of interest. Because he's not really receiving a gift, right? It's not like this road is being given to him, but there's a road and somebody's going to be taking this road. It's almost like a dative of possession. Whose road is this? Well, it's his road. It's a road for his interest, for his purposes. That's what this is, a dative of interest. So this finally wraps up our relative clause. I can kind of clean up some of my markings here. We can get back to the actual grammar of what's going on kind of in the big picture. So I'll keep all of the case forms that we've got, but let's revisit the whole thing. So rushing from that point, by the path, we might say, by the way, he himself had made for himself. That's a little bit too much in English, but we might just say he had made for himself with a bloody sword, or by means of the bloody sword. So this is going to be an ablative of instrument, which we can do with non-living things in Latin without a preposition. If we were going to do this, if a person had done this, we would need a or ab plus the ablative. But here we just have an object, an inanimate thing, so it's an instrument. So by fleeing from there, rushing away from there, by the path he had made for himself with his bloody sword through the fearful crowd. Good. That's great. So we've got all this. We still haven't explained why this is an accusative, and this is main. So I might just put an M there for main clause. Is it accusative? We don't know why yet. We know it's referring back to Gaius Mucius, but it's going to need to be probably the direct object of a verb. We'll see what it is in a few seconds. So that now, cum concursu ad clamorem facto comprehensum regii satellites retraxent, or retraxissent. Let me try that again. Retraxissent. So let's pause there. Cum. This could be either a preposition with an ablative, and it's nice that we've got an ablative there, or it could be starting a clause. So right now, let's maybe take it with this, with a running together, a kind of pulsing. Ad clamorem, to the shouting, to the hubbub, to the noise. Good. But then we get facto here, and that has to be a long O. So then we're saying, well, what could that be? Well, that has to be ablative or dative singular, and that accords quite well with this concursu we have over here. This is looking a lot like an ablative phrase, and a certain kind of one too, an ablative absolute. So with a running together, with a hubbub having been made toward the location of the shouting, toward the shouting. So people have said, hey, stop that man. And now people are running together toward that point. There was initially this fear in the crowd, but this fear is coming to the realization that, hey, we have an enemy in our midst, we need to take care of this. So now, with this concursu being taken care of, it's not just the object of this preposition, we know that this come must be heading up a larger clause. Maybe a causal, could be kind of circumstantial. We'll find out what it is once we get to our main verb. So we just kind of have to wait on this. So, but in the circumstances, because with a crowd running together toward the sound, comprehensum. So this gives us a hint. This is going to be what? From the verb comprehendo. We've seen various forms of this prehendo, to take in, to comprehend, in this sense, to kind of capture. So we know that this is coming from the fourth principal part, which is a first and second declension kind of adjective, really. So things end in us, so it's either neuter, singular, nominative, or accusative. We could have down here. Or it could also be masculine accusative. That's what it's going to be, because we kind of know what's going on. If somebody's going to be taken in, that's probably Gaius Mucius, and he is the accusative subject, or the accusative object of this sentence. So this is going to be, again, an accusative and probably an object, but we're still not even to the main clause. We had this participial phrase, we had this kind of adverbially used relative clause, and now we're getting another adverbial clause, this come clause. So eventually we'll get there, I promise. But under the circumstances, to return to come, concurso ad clamorem facto, we have a kind of running together happening toward the sound. He, having been taken, again, what kind of participle is this? It's fourth principal part, so it's perfect and passive. Perfect meaning completed in the past. Passive meaning he received this. He's not actually taking in himself, he's being taken in. So having been taken in, and this is again our object, then we have regii satellites, so the royal attendants, and this is our nominative subject. Retraxisen, and that's going to be our verb. So what kind of verb is that? Well, we've gotten familiar, or gotten used to seeing all of these, what are pluperfect subjunctives in Livy. We've seen these all the time in these come clauses, and as we've noted before, the verbs normally end the subordinate clause. So we can probably put this right here, kind of close off this bigger statement that we've got. So under the circumstances, with the crowd kind of, with there having been made a running together toward the sound, the royal attendants kind of drug back Gaius Mucius, who had been apprehended, who had been taken in. And then ante tribunal, so before, in front of the tribunal, the kind of raised dais of the king, nice genitive, a kind of possessive genitive, working back with tribunal, destitutus. So what do we do with that word? Well, we know its English derivative, destitute, right? And if you look it up in the dictionary, it says forsaken, helpless. So it's nominative. It's just like one of these, adjectives that say, it is. It's not just like, it is a first-second conjugation adjective. So this is going to be our nominative subject of the sentence moving on. Again, from context, we know that we're talking about Gaius Mucius here, which means this accusative here, all of this was kind of working with retraxiscent. So we might get a new color, kind of green, and separate this first half of the sentence from the second half that's coming up now. So ante tribunal of the king, so before the tribunal of the king, this is just a prepositional phrase. Ante can take the accusative, that's what we have here. Tribunal is neuter, so the nominative and accusative forms are always identical. Destitutus, this is masculine singular nominative. It can only be referring to Scaevola, so good. Before the tribunal of the king, he, forsaken, is. We just need to kind of supply that at this point. Then, or maybe was, because we're talking about the historical past. Then, quoque, which we know is also or even. Inter, which is a preposition, it takes the accusative. We get this nicely with tantas here, what can only be feminine accusative plural. Minas, going with that, so with such threats of fortune. That means with so much going terribly wrong for him. Among all of these things, metuendus, again, clearly nominative, masculine singular, and it is therefore the subject that we have going on. What is this? This is a gerundive, or a future passive participle. And again, just like at destitutus, we might supply est, or maybe erat. Here we can do the same thing. So he was metuendus. What do these we call them future passive participles, but they really don't imply futurity. They imply obligation, how one should act around this. So he was the type of person that one should fear. So he was fearful, magisquam, rather than fearing. So what we're saying is he's been brought before, forsaken, he's absolutely alone, and he's in front of the tribunal of the king. And at that time, even at that time, we might say, in English I think we'd want to put quoque before tum, even then, even among such great threats of fortune, Gaius Mucius was fearful rather than fearing. Fearful is a bad and kind of ambiguous word. He was causing fear. He was something that was to be feared rather than one who is himself fearing. And then we get a direct quote. Finally, we get some direct discourse here instead of indirect discourse. Romanus sum. I am a Roman, he says. Civis, a Roman citizen. Gaiam Muciam vocant. Note that with these abbreviations, you can't ultimately control the ending, but we can know from context here it has to be accusative. So it's not Gaius, it's Gaiam. Gaiam Muciam vocant. They call me Gaius Mucius. So we're now 17 minutes in. We finally got to the period, but we're only in the middle of Gaius Mucius' speech. So we're going to return. We'll probably start from Romanus Sum in the next lesson, and then move on through the rest of things that he has to say. It's a wonderful speech. I hope you'll join me. See you then.